welcome to another one of our Marketing Showcase online keynote webinars. This is the lunchtime slot, so I need to thank everyone for sticking around with us whilst they eat their lunches. I had a shepherd's pie for my lunch. I made it at the weekend. It was delicious. So why don't you start by putting in the chat what you're having for lunch today? It also lets me know that I'm not speaking to an empty room or just a camera with me and Ali on it. So make sure you put in the chat, put hello, put something, just let me know you're there. Welcome to the session. As a reward for sticking around with us for the lunchtime slot, I'm going to reward you with one of the best webinars we have of today. And it's presented by Ali Williams, who's the co-founder and creative director at Markmaking, as he discusses building a better brand, the path to positive impact and profit. It follows on for the talk that he did with us in September. So whether you managed to catch that one or not, Ali's talk is really inspiring and anyone can take a lot from this talk. So really looking forward to it. Just before we go into that, I want to just quickly teach you guys to suck eggs, as I'm sure you've probably got Zoom fatigue by now and you've heard me say this 4 or 5 times, but for those that are joining us for the first time, this is how we're going to use Zoom today. So in the chat, you can talk to me, you can tell me what you're eating for your lunch, you can tell me what you've got lined up for your lunch, you can talk to me about the event, you can give me some feedback. Use the chat to speak to me. Aside from that, we have the Q&A function, which is going to be reserved for questions of our speaker, which I mentioned today is Ali Williams. So as you're watching his presentation, have a think, what can you ask Ali Williams? What can he provide for your business at the end? And I'll pose that in a Q&A session right at the end of this talk. So use the Q&A function for any questions you have of Ali. I've waffled for way too long. I normally do that. So look, let's get underway and let's meet our speaker, Ali Williams.
Hi, Ash.
Hey, Ali, you all right?
Yeah, Sunday lunch leftovers. That's what I've
nice.
just, yeah, microwaved, just as good, very easy.
Good.
Yeah.
We've got avocado sandwiches, we've got ham and cheese, we've got all sorts of porridge. Oh, running fuel for later. So somebody's going on a jog later, so they're
slow release,
filling up on their slow release carbs. That's it. Cool. Let's stop talking about lunches and let's talk about marketing. I'm going to let you crack on. Enjoy your talk. All right.
Thank you very much. Try sharing the screen. Welcome everybody. I hope you have enjoyed or are enjoying your lunches. I'm delighted to be back, feeling a bit of pressure now after Ash's intro. I'm back to talk about building a better brand, a little bit of a tall order possibly in 20 minutes, but let's see how we go. The theme is positive impact and profitability and how we combine the both, and this idea of a better brand will become clearer, I think, as I go through the presentation. So without further ado, we've been helping organizations make their mark for over 25 years now. The challenge of standing out, the challenge for businesses of standing out doesn't get any easier. We're fighting for, amongst many more brands now, for consumers' attention. Those consumer attention spans are diminishing all the time. And on top of that, what we're now seeing is that customers expect more from brands. There's a ton of research to back this up. A couple of examples, some insights from Kantar. People expect brands to deliver real value, to act responsibly, to do the right thing by the community. In a very similar vein, from Sprout Social, when they ran a poll to see what today's consumers actually want from brands, top of the charts was being positive contributors to society. And it's not just consumers who are expecting more, so too are employees. This from Fast Company. 77% of Generation Z feel businesses should make doing good a central part of their business. 45% agreed with the statement that they'd rank working for a company that helps make the world a better place as important as salary. And that sort of sentiment is supported by research from WeSpire, the first generation, Gen Z, to prioritize purpose over salary. They read mission statements and values documents to select where they work and want their employers' values to match their own. They expect consistency and authenticity and will call you out, often publicly, if they don't see it. So being a good brand in the fullest sense is no longer just the right thing to do or a good thing to do. It's become a prerequisite for success. And we're living in times where the brands that will lead the way are what we call magnetic brands. We define magnetic brands like this. Magnetic brands are defined by an extraordinary and enduring level of attraction, loyalty, and resilience. They recognize and embrace the power of being more human in pursuit of both profit and positive impact. So where does that enduring appeal come from? That extraordinary, uncommon attraction? Well, it comes from 4 key characteristics, very human traits that we actually call the muscles of magnetism. They're purpose, imagination, generosity, and authenticity. And what's both significant and exciting about these is that, as with muscles, these are all traits that can be developed and honed and flexed in pursuit of more magnetism. And fundamentally, that means any brand has the potential to become more magnetic if they're willing to pursue that path. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about what that path is and how you and your brand can move along that journey. I'd like you to think of the path to magnetism in terms of a story, specifically your story. And you might break your story down into these key phases. Defining your story, what you stand for and why anyone should care. Articulating your story, the core assets, visual, verbal assets that bring to life what it is that you stand for. And the ongoing perpetual reinforcement of your story in everything that you do. That's the deliver piece. So I'm going to take these in turn and we're going to have a look at them through the lens of brand magnetism and see where we get to. Starting with defining your story. And defining your story through the lens of purpose, imagination, generosity, and authenticity. When you consider your story as a business, I'd like to ask yourself a few questions. Do we know exactly why we exist? Do we understand the role that we play in the lives of not just ourselves, but in the lives of others? Do we know what we stand for? And equally importantly, what do we stand against? And in our story, is there a palatable sense of determination, tenacity, and resolve? I have an example. Clearview Traffic Group, when we started working with Clearview Traffic Group a few years ago, they've been going for 40 years. They specialize in road safety and count and classification technology. So their story, when they had it originally, was very much around their products, the mechanics, the technology, the innovative qualities. It kind of worked, but they were losing their way somewhat. What we were able to do was regain a real sense of purpose in that story. And actually it was elevated to being part of their name. So they became Clearview Intelligence, and a very purposeful led story started with making journeys work. Imagination. So does your story as an organization reflect a different way of seeing the world? Magnetic brands elevate imagination into their story. So is it a product of 2 very human traits, curiosity and creativity? And perhaps most importantly, is it a story that will capture not just your own imagination, but the imagination of others? Another example for you. When we started working with Preservica, they were making real headway in the world of digital preservation. It's a pretty niche category. Essentially, they have a software platform that preserves the integrity of a digital asset over the long term. And the way they talked about themselves, the way their story was presented, much like the Clearview Traffic example, was very product orientated, very tech oriented, not really coming from the sense of a bigger picture. In terms of imagination, I think this is a good example. By the time we finished working with Preservica, they were talking and presenting themselves to the world in a very, very different way. The world's cultural, economic, social, and political memory is at risk. Our mission is to protect it. A great example, I think, of elevating imagination story. Generosity. Does your story balance profit making with making a difference? Is it a story of service and giving, not just a story of taking? Is it one of value creation and mutual benefit? The example I chose here was with another client of ours. Gatehouse Bank are a very small bank. They're Sharia compliant, but they're starting to make real headway in the wider market. When we first started working with them, their story, I think it's fair to say, was very inward focusing. This is about as close as it came to a story. It was a vision to be the most admired UK Sharia compliant bank. When we worked with them, we uncovered actually more of those generosity elements, and now they talk about themselves and they present their story in a very different way. It's about helping people realize their dreams and their aspirations, and they're able to do that through a different way, a different approach to banking. And lastly, with respect to defining your story, questions to ask yourselves: is our story credible? And by that, can we actually deliver on it? And not just now, is it attainable now? Is it sustainable in the future? Can we genuinely live it? And most importantly of all, are we prepared to? It sounds like an obvious question, but it takes commitment. And that's something we'll come on to a little bit later in this presentation. So with your story clearly defined, the next stage is to think of how you articulate that story. What core assets do we have at our disposal that we can use to really bring our story to life? Again, through the lens of magnetism. And in this case, when we're articulating our story, the focus is very much on purpose and imagination. So from a purpose perspective, when you think of your story, is your raison d'etre, is your why really coming through loud and clear? Recognise Bank is aimed at SMEs. It's an SME bank that recognises that as a community, the SME community is underserved. That's the essence of their story defined. Bringing it to life takes a little bit more creativity and thought. UK SMEs, we recognise you, the mightiest force in our economy, your ambition and diversity, your ability to innovate and inspire, your immense potential not fully realised. So too, we recognise you deliver against the odds in the face of chronic lack of support. We recognise this must change, we are recognised, and we're driving prosperity, one ambitious business at a time. So it's taking a story that's been defined and articulating in a way that really brings it to life. And in this case, and it's not appropriate for every organisation, it feels almost like a rally cry. It's a manifesto type format, but it's the difference between a kind of factual rendition of a story and actually bringing it to life in an emotive way. Imagination. So this is about leveraging creativity and specifically the power of distinctiveness. And it's important to understand the difference between differentiation and distinctiveness. Of course, in marketing, differentiation is at the heart, and it's always been at the heart of good marketing. Differentiation is about how you are actually different. It's about your intended positioning. As we've seen in the define phase of this path to magnetism, it's about your story. Businesses need to be different, but actually the emphasis in recent years has shifted somewhat, and the importance of differentiation has in some respects been superseded by the importance of what's called distinctiveness. And what we mean by distinctiveness is how much you actually stand out. So as an organization, as a brand, how easily do you come to mind? How readily are you recognized as you? It's all very well being different, but if people don't know that it's you, then it doesn't really account for much. So in terms of distinctiveness, you can consider that a quick win, because in the scheme of things, certainly in comparison to finding true differentiation, distinctiveness is actually relatively easy to achieve. And distinctiveness is about looking to your brand assets, distinctive brand assets, of which there are plenty. Here are just a few: logo, shapes, colors, the founders, your organization, font, packaging, characters, where you're located, celebrity endorsements. They form the basis of codes, and the most influential generally, as you probably suspect, are the top 3 or 4 in this case. So what I'd ask you to do is to look at your business, look at your brand and think, what are our codes? And possibly you need to revisit them. Maybe you need to go back to them. What are your distinctive brand assets? Perhaps you need to create a few more. And if you've got some that you're comfortable with, you've had for some time, the question is, are you working them as hard as you possibly can be? The example I chose for this one is the Mortgage Works. They are the intermediary buy-to-let lending arm of Nationwide Building Society. They're also the #1 buy-to-let lender in the UK. And as part of a brand tracking research program that they've been part of for nearly 13 years now, their impact or their perceptions from brokers are monitored and tracked. And the Mortgage Works has consistently been at the top, or 1 or 2 in the market, for not just recall and recognition, but also something called unprompted willingness to recommend, which is kind of the holy grail in this particular market. And what's significant about here is that the mortgage works operate in a market where the fundamental differences between their product and competitors' product are pretty marginal. There's only so far you can go with price, criteria, product range, etc. So actually here we can see the value of distinctiveness and the value of really sweating codes. So over the course of the last 15 years, not a lot has changed in terms of how they present themselves to the world. And the colour orange, the name, the mortgage works, and the figures are synonymous as distinctive brand assets / codes for the mortgage works. And that's played a significant part in their success over that period. And lastly, authenticity. Just quickly on this, it is possible to oversell ourselves. You can have a great story, you've defined your story, but you can overcook it. We've been there ourselves with a client that will remain unmentioned. But if you do that, then obviously the end experience of the consumer, there's a severe mismatch in terms of what they're expecting. So be mindful of that, be authentic. Moving on to deliver. So again, thinking about your story, how are you reinforcing your story in everything that you do? The clue is in the title, the clue is in the word. This is about living your story, and living your story has two aspects to it. There's an internal element and there's an external element, and it's an inside out exercise. You need to find ways to embed your story. So let's start with internal. And again, let's consider how we can look through the lens of magnetism when we're delivering our story. Purpose and being purposeful. It's really important that you recognize that committing to a culture that embraces and perpetuates what you stand for is the key to success. So when you're thinking about this, ask yourself, have we actually built our story into everything that we do? From the way that we recruit, from the way that we retain and engage our employees, to the way that we develop our people. And coupled with that, overlapping with that, if you like, is the use of imagination, the use of creativity. Are there ways, more creative ways, in which we could be engaging our people to help them understand our story? Generosity plays a part as well, because if we can involve and we can empower our people to be an active part of that process, the likelihood of buy-in, the likelihood of alignment is going to be far greater. And there's a note here for, if you're a business owner, business leader, that the value of showing some of yourselves, and I mean in this context, heart and soul, and nothing that might lead to a tribunal, but showing a degree, showing that passion, showing those human qualities, showing that vulnerability is really important. That's an act of giving in itself. Nice example for you here, Brook Street de Roche, a commercial property law firm. We worked with them at the point at which we'd started working with them. They were already starting to rethink their story and bring some clarity to their story. We helped them define a story that essentially revolved around 4 fundamental tenets. This idea of less is more, which is about being more efficient to the benefit of their customers, their clients. The idea of not being arrogant, which is often a perception with law firms, so it's about quiet confidence. Direct and personal was really important, and this idea of ongoing quest to build really meaningful relationships. As part of that exercise, we looked at their identity and we revamped, in fact, their brand identity in such a way that whilst they had a logo that sat at the core of the visual assets, that logo worked in a particular way, as you can see here. It's a 4-line quatrain whereby you can organisation for a short statement. That can be something that's talking about the business. It can be something a little bit more subtle, it can be contextual, and the effect of this was to, in terms of engaging internally with living the story, was to get everybody involved, and very quickly everyone within the organization understood what was trying to be achieved, what they were trying to communicate, what was the rationale behind this as a creative solution, and we're becoming very active in the process of coming up with new lines. So much so that for a significant time afterwards, every email that came through from this particular client came in this 4-line quatrain format, which was terrific. I think it showed that they had fully bought into the concept, but it did present a personal challenge in having to reply equally wittily every time an email came in. And authenticity in terms of internally. There is so much, and I'm sure many of you have been businesses that have had some very difficult things to deal with recently, furlough, redundancies, etc. And of course, there are tons of guidelines there on how to manage that process. I think the really important thing to remember is to make sure it's still in your voice. You're still doing it your way. Take the guidance, do it the correct way, but also add your own personality to it. Externally, how do we live our story? Purpose. Well, this really relates to being purposeful in terms of marketing and communications objectives. Andy, in his previous talk, mentioned the importance of objectives. We're all familiar with SMART objectives, but quite often when we get caught up in the quagmire of tactical marketing activity, SMART objectives can go out of the window. So make sure your objectives are purposeful. Imagination. Are we leveraging the full power of creativity in our marketing, in our communications and in our customer experiences? And a nice way to think about that is in thinking in terms of moments. Moments really endure in people's minds. So if you can find within your marketing, within your communication activity, within your experience activity, ways to create moments, it's something I'd really strongly recommend pursuing. A nice example from a client of ours, Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, a few years ago, they, like all the other Shakespeare institutions around the world, were celebrating the 400th anniversary of the passing of Shakespeare, also his 452nd birthday, it would have been. And everyone had pretty much the same challenge. How do we gain share of voice during this particular busy time? The idea we developed for Shakespeare, Selfie with Shakespeare, was informed by quite a simple insight. People engage on social media. You and I were split into two different groups. There's the informers who share content about other things, and there are the me-formers who like to send content about themselves. Perhaps not surprisingly, we are 80% me-formers, and hence Selfie is such a popular pastime. So Selfie with Shakespeare very simply involved some props and invited fans of Shakespeare to pose with those props. And it was hugely effective, resulted in a 200% increase in social engagement during that period and for a period afterwards. And it's just a really nice example of leveraging imagination in living your story. Also with imagination, are we thinking bigger? Crikey, this is tons of lectures worth here, but if you're not familiar with the work of Binet and Field, I would implore you to go and have a look. They're the authors of the long and the short of it. How does that relate here? Well, thinking bigger in living your story. Most businesses tend to be more tactically oriented. It's short-term sales activation, marketing activation, as represented by that sawtooth red jagged line there. It results in peaks and troughs of sales activity and profit, but no gain over the long term. That's where brand building comes in. That's what we're talking about today. That's about building deeper emotional connections. And the trick is to balance the two. Broadly a 50-50 split. It varies on the category that you're in. But the objective is to ensure that you are focusing your budget, splitting your budget in such a way that you are not only doing the sales activation, but you are building brand over the long term. So think bigger. Generosity, a willingness to give, help or support, especially more than is usual or expected. I've put that in because it's not just about money. Time and expertise, transparency, these are all examples of giving. We've seen a ton of it this year. I think what's been, if there's been any light in all the gloom, it's seeing so many organisations as well as individuals change what they're doing, divert their resources for the greater good. Something that we initiated back in 2013 actually was an idea called Project Pledge. We ran a short survey to see what was valued more, time or money. Perhaps not surprisingly, time is valued more than money. And we used that as the basis to start a campaign where we would ourselves give up any spare time we had and our expertise to help not just charities, but any organisations that we felt were trying to do something good. And as part of Project Pledge, the idea was to encourage others to do the same. Authenticity. Are we being true to our story? Are we walking the walk? Are we walking the talk? And are we doing it every day? And we are doing it in every way. There are so many examples of this, but it's so easy to get wrong. And it goes right back to the first point. You know, if however you define your story, you have to be able to live it. It has to be credible. You have to fully commit to it. I've used here Nationwide. They're a client of ours. Their brand purpose at the highest level is building society nationwide. I think what's really interesting about them is they live that both at the macro and the micro level. So one of the organisations that they very much support is Shelter. The beginning of lockdown, when Nationwide had some TV media space to run, but they didn't have any ads that they actually could use to fill those slots, they donated that airtime to Shelter. You know, a very, very generous and authentic gesture given their purpose. But at the flip side of the scale, something they also did at the onset, the beginning of the first lockdown, was to get in touch with myself and ask me for the names and addresses of everybody at Markmaking who had specifically worked on projects for them in the run up to Easter at the height of lockdown, simply so they could send them a box of chocolates as a thank you. So at a time when possibly suppliers and partners are the last people they're going to be thinking about, they were still living their brand in the most authentic way. So there we have it, the path to magnetism. Center it around your story. And I'd ask you to take a moment, look at your particular business, your organization, look at it in terms of these three phases of activity, and consider purpose, imagination, generosity, and authenticity. How are you faring? You know, where are you falling short? Where are the quick wins potentially? What needs dire attention? What needs some steady attention over a period of time? And if you're struggling, typically that can be because you're in a delivery phase without real clarity, without real distillation of your story, let alone clarity around how you articulate that story. So it might require taking one or two steps back, and I'd really urge you to do that, particularly now, particularly this year. That's essentially it. I believe that is my last slide. So on that note, thank you very much for listening. Back to you, Ash.
Well done, Ali. Really good talk. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Pleasure.
Really enjoyed it. So thanks for taking up the time to do that. Just before I go on a little bit further, I'm going to pop the poll up, which we spoke about. As I've done in some of the other talks, this is a chance to get some time on your own with Ali to discuss brand magnetism a little bit further for your brand and how he can help. So if you want that, or if you want me to put you in touch with Ali, please put yes, please, and I'll make sure he's got your details so you can continue the conversation. And whilst people carry on and do that in the background, I wanted to ask you a few questions, and I'd kind of encourage our visitors, if you've got any questions at this point, to put them in the Q&A. Ali, something that I wondered about was, actually, no, I'll tell you what we'll do first. I wanted to know from that talk, obviously you shared so much stuff. I always say it's a really inspirational talk. What would you tell marketers to get on with next week? What's the best thing that they should go forward and really crack on with?
Crikey. I would use that framework. I would take that DAD process. And you know, the reality is some things do take more time than others. But I think if you can find the space to do it and you can involve the right stakeholders, I mean, you might be the decision maker, you might need to engage a board. The challenge is going to vary, but given your particular role within your organization, look at what on that path, where potentially are there the quick wins for you? Where can you start seeding some ideas with the decision makers within? And if you are one of those decision makers, you know, take a step back and look at that first stage. How well have we defined our story? Are we really clear what we stand for in the market, who we're serving and why we're serving them?
Great, Ali. And you touched upon it there, but one of the things that I find really interesting when I speak to marketers and visitors to our events is they can be as passionate as you like. They can crack on, they can do all of this stuff. They can get really fired up and build brilliant plans, but often they find that when they try to communicate those plans to their colleagues or the wider business, you mentioned stakeholders there, they don't share the same enthusiasm. And all of a sudden things get really difficult. Are there any sort of tips that you can give to people that find themselves in that position?
Bring it back to money. Bring it back to return on investment. All the sorts of things we're talking about today in some form or another can be measured and can contribute to that. Part of the challenge in bringing brand to the boardroom, as people talk about, is that it's perceived as not having that immediate commercial value, and it really does. I mean, probably the best business case you could pull together and most quickly would be to draw on the work of Binet and Field. The slide that I showed very quickly, marketing activation, which is where most people are, couple that with brand building, which most people don't do. They're the businesses that really thrive over the long term. They're the business who have been investing where they've been able to, where the pockets are deep enough in building their brand through this period. They won't be holding back on their marketing unless they absolutely have to. So you read up on that, use some of that, but make it about the return. I think that's the only way to get the ear, particularly of the financial director.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. And again, thanks for your time, Ali, for taking the time to talk us through your presentation today. Again, I found it inspiring, and I'm sure our visitors did too. I can see in the chat a few of them are saying the same. So that obviously went down very well. And I'd like to thank all of the visitors, obviously, for joining us for our fifth and penultimate talk for today's Marketing Showcase Online. We have one talk left, which is presented by brand new speaker Anna Downs, as she discussed video marketing and how you can use that to reach, connect, and engage with your audience. So please do tune in for that one. You can join either via the email that we send you as a reminder or via our website. So head on to there, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. Ali, that's all we have time for. So I want to thank one final time. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you all have a brilliant day.
Thanks everyone for listening. Thank you.